Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. So just to continue on the train of thought that I've finished with, yeah, the problem is not, people can easily say people are not informed, they're not educated. Yes, but what happens when you try and educate them, right? It's not like everybody is just, starving to be educated and to know things. Oftentimes it's more the younger people who know they don't really know much and they want to understand, so there's a lot better opportunity to actually recruit these people, and that's what we have to do. You actually have to recruit young people and explain to them that right now it's not your fault, but humanity doesn't have a future if we don't actually win this fight. And the problem is that even if you explain things to people and they do understand it, it's an emotional block. And that's what I want to kind of address. What's wrong with the way people think about themselves today? Especially, the classic is always, this happens so often, somebody sees our signs, our setup, and they say, oh yeah, I know all about that. And they just keep walking. Like they don't even stop, and we're saying stop World War III. Past Glass-Steagall, and they know all about that, and they didn't stop, which is pretty paradoxical, very paradoxical. And that's because emotionally these people are very weak. They're not actually able to respond to reality. They're like voyeurs, right? They're watching reality. They're waiting for something to happen. So they don't actually see themselves as in this process. They're waiting for something to happen. And so today, that's the point, I want to address this cultural problem using the subject matter of a few poems and some other artistic examples, some classical artistic examples, not just any art, because that could also really disorganize you if I was just to use anything, as we'll see. So with that said, right away, let's just jump into the first poem, which is going to set the pace for how we want to think about things. We're going to have to discover what this is really about. I'll just read the first one. I'm going to ask people to help out to read things as well. So this is by John Keats, who was a poet who died at the age of 24. And he managed to actually excel and become one of the greatest English poets that human history has ever seen at 24. And he was actually sick for a large part of his life, so he wasn't always in a condition to actually write beautiful things. So he says, and it's just titled, there's no title, it's the first line. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and carricktree hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night-starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and feel that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. What are people's first thoughts on this? When you first think about this, and we can read it a second time, in fact, Rush says that to understand a good classically composed poem, you have to read it 2-3 times. But on first glance, what kind of mood do you think he's in?
Pressed for time.
Pressed for time.
Got to hustle. Got to get stuff done. You may not.
Okay.
Stuff like that.
Okay. How's he doing for time then?
He lived to be 24.
Right.
So he basically just says that, that he's just worried that he won't be able to completely fulfill his dreams, which is what he's saying. He just doesn't have the time for it. Not busyness or anything. That's just
okay.
Short.
And can I just see how many people have actually read any of John Keats' poetry before today? Can we have a show of hands?
I heard about it many years ago, but I've never read it.
Does a tiny amount count?
Pardon me?
A tiny amount?
A tiny amount, yeah, sure. Okay. So you've had a taste. Okay, well, let's try another one. And because we're going to get back to this, but I want you to think about, it's interesting what Salim said, pressed for time. You know, if you think about the way people are reacting today when we're talking about the danger of World War III, economic collapse, that we actually have to launch these things like the new Silk Road, fusion power, they don't seem very pressed for time on these issues. But yet when you actually invite them to an event, you know, they're interested, they seem to never have time, you know, to actually become political, to actually do something, be an active force in this. So this one is by Wordsworth, who was another poet around Keats's time, a bit before, and during as well.
Dave, can you try and adjust the focus?
Yeah.
Is
that better? So let's get a sense of what this one's about. Can somebody read this for me? And, Salim, go ahead.
I wandered lonely as a cloud, by William the Wordsworth, that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine, and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretch in never-ending line, along margins of a bay. 10,000 I saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, when then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. That is beautiful.
Okay. What do you think it's about? And I just have to, this is just one small, the title is also the first line. I think it was just pasted.
Yeah, I wandered lonely as a cloud.
Yeah, and then you go to the next line. But what do you, and not just Salim, it's not going to work, but what do you think? What's the start? You said it's beautiful, that's a big statement.
It is beautiful, it is beautiful. It's because the way how it makes it is how an observer, it seems like that he's not really taking part in this because he's flying as a cloud. This could be another way of saying that he's basically being a spectator of life elsewhere, and that he just simply, that even this fills him with such great pleasure, but at the same time he's just not there with them. He's not with the people who are dancing and the line or everything else. He's observing them from a distance, but at the same time this brings him such great joy at the, you know, the
okay.
Basically, like, you know.
Well, what kind of emotions would we say is going on here? And I'm gonna pick on somebody. Sorry, I have a bad habit of doing this. Matthew, what do you think is? Don't mind me. Yeah, pick something. What kind of emotions would you say? We can read it again if we might want to read it again. Here, why don't you read it again?
Yeah. Okay. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. When all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the trees. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle in the Milky Way, they stretch in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. Then thousands saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance.
Okay, let's just stop there for a second. So up until now, you know, I'm getting, he's talking about daffodils, right? Golden daffodils. He sounds pretty, you know, entertained by them, right? Or amazed by the daffodils, amazement. C'est des pissenlits. Il est pas mal impressionné par des pissenlits, right?
Not a flower.
You guys ever walked through a field of daffodils and
I haven't walked.
you're really like, wow, this is amazing, right?
I haven't walked in a field of flowers in a long time.
Yeah, maybe everybody should do that. They'd be more relaxed, right? Just to keep going.
The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a conjunct company.
Shocking company.
Jacon company, sorry. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my coach I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils.
It's almost like he was taking the daffodils for granted, and then he's realized how.
How awesome they are.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to something else. Let's just think about that, because I think that's, for this one, you know, I think there's more to be said. I don't think we've really scratched the surface of what, how Keats is actually thinking about all this. Sure, it's one thing to be pressed for time, but people are pressed for times for all sorts of things, right? Some people may be around here to actually get to the meeting on time, while some people are pressed to, you know, do their makeup, their everything, their hair.
Catch a television show.
Catch a television show. People get really vicious sometimes if they're gonna miss their show.
I know.
So we're gonna use two more examples, because we really have to draw this out, work it through, and really get a sense of what's wrong with the way people think about themselves today, right? What are actually their priorities? Why is that their priorities? What are the right priorities? You know, what's the right thing to do? Is there a right thing to do with your life as opposed to a wrong thing? Or is it really do what makes you happy? You know, stare at daffodils your whole life, because that's what makes you happy. So here, why don't I read this one? From fairest creatures we desire increase, that there by beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender hire might bear his memory. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies. Thyself, thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel. Thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, and only herald to the gaudy spring, within thine own bud buryest thy content, and, tender churl, makest waste and niggarding. Pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due by the grave in thee. This is the first sonnet in Shakespeare's series, his sonnet series, that goes on for 155, where he develops really
If I can
a
just,
scene.
if I
Well,
can just say.
I want to hear somebody else first, just
I'm so sorry.
just so you don't, you know, taint what
I
other
didn't
people
want to
do.
lower this call.
What do people think? Has anybody ever read this before? I asked for Keats. How many people have read Shakespeare's poetry or sonnets before today? Can I see a show of hands? How many people have read them before today?
The whole thing?
Okay,
Or
so no, just the sonnets in general.
Okay.
So we're gonna go slow because we.
What does he mean by making a famine where abundance lies?
Well, you know, interesting. Let's say this is it's not the same thing, but on a simple level, in making a famine, you know, let's say Africa, there's plenty of food, but and it's not going to anybody. So you have something, but its use is being spoiled, right? You have a famine where abundance lies. Abundance, there's plenty, yet it's not going to use, right? There's a waste. There's a wasteful quality to it.
This is the crux of the strategy of the British Empire. This is
Go
what
on.
we're seeing throughout Europe, throughout here in Canada. This is the whole centerpiece of the fracking of Canadian, where even here our own government is telling us we're, well, you know, in the EU it's austerity and
Yeah.
so on. And
Could you refine that in terms of, what do you mean specifically this? Could you draw
well,
out
in that
what makes you
specific
think
phrase,
that?
making a famine where abundance lies.
Okay, but keep
I
in
see.
mind what's what's Shakespeare actually talking about. The only other thing, sorry, do people, when he says increase, from fairest creatures we desire increase, that means increase has to do with the belly getting big birth, carrying labor, carrying a child, having a child. So from fairest creatures we desire increase, that there by beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender hire might bear his memory.
Not air.
Air.
His tender air might bear his memory. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies. Thyself thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel. So, just that first part, do people have any hypotheses as to what?
Like, I think he's talking about some sort of potential going wasted.
Okay, what potential?
Well, so I don't quite get what, as the riper should by time decease, but based on what.
Okay, well, are you getting younger? Do you know anybody who's getting younger?
Oh, you're saying as you get more ripe, your time for existing is deceasing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Decreasing.
given that it will eventually perish.
Yeah,
So there's
like
no
any good fruit,
mortality.
at some point it's going to get riper and riper until it's just,
Till it rots on the vine.
yeah. Till it rots on the vine, that's interesting, right? Are people in our society being fruitful, or are they rotting on the vine? If you look at the way most people live their lives.
A lot of them really are running. If you want to be more poetic, you say wither on the vine. That sounds better.
Sure, in any case it's tragic, right?
Yeah.
So how do we overcome this tragedy, right? And that's why it's important to read Shakespeare, to read these poets, because the point that Schiller makes, Friedrich Schiller, who's the German poet, which our organization in Europe is named after, is that when a culture is completely degenerated, when you live in a society where there is no real point of reference for what's good, or what is a good moral standard, or who is a good idol or hero for today, for, let's say, children, who should they look up to, right? The president, there's a lot of rappers,
Oh, yeah,
musicians. Look at the musicians that are popular. Your daughter Katy Perry, who's she supposed to look up to, right? So so thyself thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel, thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, and only herald to the gaudy spring, within thine own bud buryest thy content, and tender churl makest waste and niggarding. Pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due by the grave and thee. Let's try a second one. It's the second sonnet of Shakespeare's sonnet series. Could I have somebody else read this?
It's the same on the page. Oh, it's different.
Why don't you go, Meredith? I see your...
When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a trottered weed of small worth held. When being asked, where all thy beauty lies, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, to say within thine own deep sunken eyes, were an all-eating shame and thriftless praise. How much more praise deserved thy beauty's use, if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse. Proving his beauty by succession thine. This were to be new made when thou art old, and see thy blood warm when thou feelst it cold.
When thou feelest cold.
Feelst it. And see thy blood warm when thou feelst it cold.
So, if we take from the first one, right, you just said from the beginning, from fairest creatures we desire increase, right? So this question of reproducing, you want to reproduce, you want to, if you think in a first approximation, in this question of immortality, that are human beings just animals that just live, for pleasure and wanting to avoid pain. This is often the polemic that Lyndon LaRouche is making, that that's really what people's lives are reduced to today. You know, they're looking for entertainment, they're looking for fun, they're looking to have a good time. But what about the future? What about people who come after you, right? So in first approximation, this idea that everybody can contribute to the future, can become immortal in some way. Well, giving birth, you can have a child, you can have a family, so that you're actually able to continue the process of developing mankind. Your child, you hope, becomes some great person, becomes some person who can actually contribute to society that you're proud of. You know, my child did this, my child did that. You hear parents, you know, bragging about their children all the time in all sorts of different degrees, depending on what their children does. But it could just be an A on a test, and the parent is completely, you know, they're so happy, right? They're overcome with joy. So in the first one, right, it's clear that he's saying for let's say a beautiful person who never decides to actually have a child, right? Your life ends with you. Your life ends when you're in that grave. And what you have contributed or left behind, what's left of you, there's nothing to show for it. So there's actually a cutoff point. And the point is that, well, everybody's going to die, so everybody does have a cutoff point, a mortal cutoff point, which they should think about. What are they going to contribute to the future?
Are you saying that that first one's like sort of a warning?
A warning.
Yeah, yeah.
That's interesting.
I saw it as the person trying to find immortality through actually having a child, but failing to actually give, like actually sort of tying themselves up and failing to give what they actually had.
Right, well, I don't think this person, thyself thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel.
Yeah.
And just above, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel.
Yeah.
Right, so what is your life being lived for?
Yeah, it's more like motivated by their own self. Like where he says, and only herald to the gaudy spring. Like this person's only living for the springtime, but there's other seasons that
Right.
sometimes are a little bit more
Right.
uncomfortable.
It's actually an interesting, it's a 4-part video series called In Search of Shakespeare, where what this guy that put this together said is that when Shakespeare actually wrote this, it was a very interesting situation because Shakespeare had a cousin that was a poet that was being persecuted by Queen Elizabeth I. He ended up being imprisoned and executed. And this guy had written a book, 2WS, is perhaps Will Shakespeare. And the whole polemic of this is, attacking, what is the true duty of a poet? And if you sort of think of the early plays with Shakespeare, really sort of frivolous stuff in a certain sense. And then, so, you have the execution of this guy, his cousin, and I don't know the actual time frame, but you also have the death of his son. And so the real question is who is this addressed to?
Mm-hmm.
You would have to sort of know more about the history behind it, but that would be an interesting question.
Well, we're going to get some help from Lyndon LaRouche, from a absolutely revolutionary paper he wrote in the 1970s called Beyond Psychoanalysis, and LaRouche basically just redefines all of psychology, and with that, any theory about art or how we're actually supposed to think about what it means to create something, to artistically. So he starts by this question of composition. So I'd ask Matthew to read this. It's for, pardon me?
Which Matthew?
Matthew, Eric, yeah. It's for like 3 pages, so it's important to just really think about this. But this is going to give us an approach to actually, how serious is this question of art? Which Schiller says, just to be clear, right? Art is the ideal. Art is where you're actually able to take people out of, if in actuality there is no way out, how can you actually inspire somebody? Where are they going to actually find inspiration, the sense of creative inspiration, where they can now, in themselves, as Avneet said, find something, evoke something, where now they actually have a solution to a problem. They can actually act on reality and change it.
Any intensive effort to learn to compose like Beethoven confronts the musician with a fundamental antinomy apparently identical with that adduced by Immanuel Kant. It is possible, to a certain extent, to develop from Beethoven's compositions various phases of evolution of what seem to be definite rules of composition. Yet no matter how gifted the musician so equipped, he could not realize a single composition in this way that would not be immediately distinguishable as a mere parody. This demonstrates that the peculiar power and identity of any important Beethoven composition is located in qualities which are beyond comprehension in terms of any possible fixed set of formal rules. This demonstrates that the essential feature of such compositions is something which lies outside the domain of any understanding in terms of formal logic, etc. Yet, like Descartes' "I think," it exists. Proceeding from that initial predicament, I guess that is the predicament that the composition can't be understood in any logical way, right?
There's no fixed set of rules,
Right.
which will become very important.
Proceeding from that initial predicament, the next phase of the formal investigation is properly implied by the nature of the problem. To understand Beethoven systematically, that is, self-consciously, it is indispensable to master the rules, the canons, to adduce certain evolving such canons for Beethoven's work as a whole, and to also adduce the new canons developed in that way. This professional competence is indispensable precisely to be able to isolate those features of the composition in which the prior rules are diabolically violated. Concentrating for the moment on the major compositions from approximately Opus 95 onwards, it is sufficient for present illustration to identify two general kinds of tricks he introduces to give these works their living substance, their existence. The ruses of an hubristic génie, engaged in using and even creating the rules apparently precisely to violate them. We emphasize the special use of counterpoint and arbitrary surprises to achieve such ironies. The case of counterpoint, especially as Beethoven develops this essence of Western music, emphasizes the meaning of irony in this setting. Counterpoint, properly realized for its creative potentialities, is a means for exploiting a set of canons to canonically reach structural relations within the composition which are potentially in more or less rude violation of those same canons. Surprise is a basic approach to realizing the same effect in the opposite fashion. One introduces an ostensibly alien feature and then guilefully makes its existence appear to be canonical through development, which resolves the contradiction in apparently lawful way, though through the creation of new formalities.
So this is just to say, it's because I don't want to take it just anywhere. He's applying it to music, and then he's going to bring it to poetry. But to just keep in mind what he's saying here about this question of actually going against, there's something that's changing. The idea that you're just going to find a single way of thinking about it in a composition or in any sort of truly creative action. That doesn't happen. There's no formula, right? There's no formula when you talk to somebody to get them to actually do something, to understand what the idea behind what we're saying is, that we can actually crush this imperial system and actually launch a new renaissance. If we're an imperial system, and you think about the laws of an imperial system, you say, well, there's nothing you can do, you're an imperial system. How are you going to get into renaissance? The rules in a renaissance system and the rules in an imperial system, they don't coincide, right? So people really have a logical way of approaching reality when reality doesn't work like that at all. right? Because there's been from Dark Ages, Renaissances. So what's the actual process that takes place such that reality is, and these explanations are false. They don't work. It's not true, you can't do anything. As we'll see, there's a secret. So if it's not true, you can't do anything, what must you do instead?
Beethoven's late discovery of the fuller potentialities and significance of the fugue is the most powerful demonstration of a creative principle within music. The introduction of ironical improvisations into musical composition by itself would be merely a petit bourgeois anarchistic irrationalist's act. Truth, especially in the sense that Beethoven is truth, especially in the sense that Beethoven is a fanatic for truth in music, lies outside both the Apollonian bathos of pure formalism and Dionysian anti-intellectualism, that is, anti-humanism or bestialism, of the capricious violation of law for the sake of asserting an animal sort of freedom from law. Freedom in Beethoven is as totally bounded by necessity as it is in the same principled way for Karl Marx. His great late fugues most exactly express that principle of truth. Yeah.
Can I have this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sure. Keep going.
To understand the reason why the fugue in its various developments, examples, fantasy fugue, variations and fugues, etc. In Bach, Beethoven, is the highest achievement of musical composition to date. It is necessary to see music as created to celebrate that quality in the composer, performer, and audience, which otherwise expresses the noblest human qualities of daily life. Turning our view of daily life to that subsumed by our general thesis on the most primitive level of overview of the human condition, necessity is represented in terms of fixed, natural, and man-made laws. Reality presented to society and individual in terms determined apparently by such laws is constantly a struggle for existence. In this view, freedom appears as the problem-solving mental activity and realized practice by which such necessity-bounded problems of existence are resolved. On a higher level, man-made law and technology are seen as evolving, with the result that the notion of freedom is also enlarged in a similar way. Man, in this second view, is free to synthesize changes in fixed man-made and technology laws, but not in a totally arbitrary example, not in an anarchistic way. The freedom through which man-made and technological laws can be changed for the benefit of the individual and society's existence is itself restricted by a necessity governing this. Arbitrary or anarchistic freedom in an art evokes properly the same degree of intellectual interest as crude cheating at solitaire.
Just to see, do people just there have a difference, see a difference in the two kinds of freedom that he's introducing here? Because the idea that there's a necessity involved in being free versus this anarchistic idea of freedom, are people familiar with these two kinds of ideas? Is it clear for anybody? You should all say no if it's not clear. Okay.
Can I just, there's one where you need an organization to make sure that everybody can freely operate together, and the other where everybody is more freely doing their own voluntary actions. Is that distinctions?
Sure, yeah, that's good. You wanna think of what the two societies will actually look like, actively, if that's really the principle, because it's like, okay, well, there'll be more freedom in one society than another, but is it really that? You were gonna say?
Well, in my mind, he's speaking about a pretty low level of idea of freedom, which is to just basically be able to do whatever you want and who cares about the rules, sort of thing. The ability to just go against whatever rules are there is considered to be freedom. which is what he calls the bestial form.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other idea of freedom is actually a struggle, a successful struggle to resolve problems that sort of a necessary struggle, resolution of a necessary struggle that comes about because of the things pressing on you from life itself, where in order to keep going, you have to resolve the problem. And it's in the resolution of the problem, or the acting of resolution of the problem, that you find actually freedom. And I think he points to actually, to actual power.
Because the question is, how can you be free in this society? If we live under an empire and it's like a police state and all these things, the idea that, how are you going to free others? How are you going to free people if you're actually in a position where you're able to fight against this and actually introduce solutions? Then what do you actually need to free others who feel helpless and say there's nothing you can do? Right? What is their idea of freedom? At that point, once they say there's nothing you can do, they're still doing all sorts of very arbitrary things, obviously to amuse themselves, entertain themselves, because they know they can't really change things, which is what deep down they'd really like to do. And if they knew they had that chance, they'd probably give up most of their bad habits and most of their petty concerns if they thought there would actually be something real that they could do. And they would feel free at that point that they could actually do something. So people who tell you that are really trapped, right? They're really enslaved when even they don't like it to their own idea, right? And they just don't know how to fight against that idea. They have no intellectual infrastructure or emotional capacity to overcome themselves. And I'd just like to all continue reading.
Yeah, I think that's very important because when we talk to people, especially ourselves, the African people or the Congolese people, they always, we always say, but Albert's problem has always been that way. Problem has been always that way. Problem has been, people have always acted that way. What can we do to, you think you can change anything?
Well, that's exactly it. That's why art is so important, because everybody today, they're always saying that people are greedy, people are this. And what's the reality? Everybody's being held up the image of a talking pig, which is the average person that you run into, unfortunately, especially in media, in all sorts of different things. We're surrounded by talking pigs in terms of the way people live their lives. If you think of the Shakespeare sonnets that he started with, in terms of what are their concerns, they're really concerns of almost virtually a talking pig. So how are you going to elevate them? This is why you need art. Art is actually, it becomes the most important weapon and tool if you're going to actually take on an oligarchy, because you have to give them a sense of what truth is, what the ideal actually is, which is what's actually true, which is what you see in art. Because that's the point. How are they going to overcome themselves? That's the real issue. How do you overcome yourself? So
then you mean that if you meet people like, these are people I meet every day.
We meet them every day too. We're on the same boat, yeah.
And that's why I feel that it is very important that we come out from this class with a kind of clear.
Yes. This is what it's all about.
Method about if you meet people say things had always been that way and we think we cannot change it.
Yeah.
How can you proceed?
How do we get them to overcome themselves at that point? That's the issue. Well, that's what we're getting at. We haven't touched the, it's going to get to the meat. I'll just keep reading to move it along. Freedom in musical composition. So think of this idea of freedom in art. It's important. Freedom in musical composition becomes moving, exciting, when it expresses a solution to the problem of lawfully altering fixed necessity. The late Beethoven fugues express this principle in the highest form found in art, since the peculiarity of the form is that it is so emphatically the creation of a new order of necessity through the introduction and development of those selected expressions of freedom, which accomplished a transition from one set of old canons to a new set. The same principle is encountered in the admittedly rare work of poetry. To the extent that a poem locates its subject matter in the literal or symbolic features of the composition, the poet has accomplished little better than to represent prosaic ideas in a precious fashion. Bad poetry, in this respect, is associated with an emphasis on forms as such. By this standard, for example, T.S. Eliot is not a poet, and he's held up as a very big, great modern poet. And the fascist poet, Ezra Pound, is actually only a semi-poet, by contrast with the banality of Eliot. The subject of a great poem is never identified within the body of the poem, neither literally nor symbolically. Rather, the predicates of the composition uniquely demand the reader's conceptualization of a subject matter which thus seems to lie outside the poem as such. The identity of that subject matter, exactly like Descartes' I think in this respect, is nonetheless precise. This does not mean that poetry is properly a clever method of circumlocution. The subject matter of poetry is properly the sort of definite notion which does not admit of communication in extant prose forms. By this standard, Shelley is inferior to Heine as a poet. For example, Heine's ironical juxtaposition of loved persons and places in such a fashion that neither can be competently adduced as the subject, but the subject is nonetheless powerfully definite as the dialectical content. Such unearthed, unartificial compactness Shelley rarely masters. Yet, his Ode to the West Wing is a suitable clinical case. West Wind, I always say that. Is a suitable clinical case for illustrating the principle we have cited. And I just wanted, the key thing is at first, everybody know what a predicate is, right? When you're saying the predicates of a poem, you could be talking about many different images in a poem, but yet get across a similar idea. You know, like the example you want to give to somebody about, why nuclear power is good. You could give 10 million different reasons and examples of why it's good, different cases, be it for desalinating water, be it for energy to run high-speed rail through the Bering Strait to connect the continents. There's all sorts of different examples, but the idea is that fusion is good. So in a poem as well, you have different predicates. Wordsworth was talking about daffodils. It's not clear what Keats was talking about. We have to see that again. But as Salim said, he sounds pressed for time. So what's that about, though? What's he so pressed for time for? What's his intention?
I think it's just he wants to. I don't know if I just it was a rhetorical question.
Okay, I'll just because we're gonna get there's after this. Great. It is admittedly possible to offer a banalized reading of the Ode. Banal means just, very...
Who cares?
Yes, who cares? It doesn't really mean anything. Provided one degrades the change of seasons into a matter of symbolism. This bowdlerized reading of the poet's intention evaporates for us the instant we take into account the fact that the true poetic faculty is associated with the most powerful kinds of agonized feeling states. No great poem could be written with the kind of personal attachment which the symbolic interpretation of the Ode imputes to Shelley at the time of composing. Any person who has tasted the capacities for creative poetry within himself has probably frequently experienced the following sort of circumstances as those in which the impulse to write poetry overcame him. The poet experiences moments in which there is a conjunction between profound concern for others and a simultaneous agony respecting his incapacity or limited powers to aid those others. This conjunction challenges his identity in the most profound way, challenging him to create within himself, to force from his unconscious processes some new power for consciousness. Without such a new power, he must fail at that particular conjunction, threatening his deepest sense of inner self identity, the real inner self, as distinct from the persona. ignorant outsiders, including numerous literati, conclude from the discernment of agony in great poetic works that some ordinary sort of personal disappointment, bereavement, etc., must therefore be the prompting of the poem. In certain examples, undoubtedly, there is a specious germ of truth in such edifications. What mere educated men, that is, men lacking a sense of creative powers in themselves, fail to recognize is that the creative personality has a different sense of inner identity than exists for the proverbial 99 and 44/100% of the population of capitalist society in particular, where the ordinary alienated individual vaguely senses the existence of some inner little me as a kind of banalized monad. The creative individual, especially the great poets and composers, locates as his inner self precisely his power for creativity. While such a poet may also experience the ordinary sort of agonies, his development of self-conscious creative powers has endowed him with a capacity for a kind of agony which is generally unknown in this way to alienated persons. The alien pressure to be an ordinary person, the difficulty in communicating certain kinds of conceptions to a banalized audience uniquely, problems characteristic of self-conscious creativity, confronts the creative person with a recurrent fear of a special kind of death, fear of the day on which these egregious, fragile creative powers will cease to exist for him. It is that agony which he invariably experiences whenever he is in the throes of creative effort, and that agony which is at the same time his most powerful motivation for creative output. Hence, to be confronted in any way with the image of a human problem he cannot solve with his existing knowledge confronts the creative artist with the most powerful motive for drawing new qualities of knowledge from his creative powers, and at the same time threatens him with a kind of agony which few persons experience, the dreadful thought that perhaps his creative powers have mysteriously vanished, died, since his last creative output. This is the last one. It is in that way that the fear of death of the creative inner self produces great agonies as the circumstances, theme, and motive of most of the great creative artistic productions of our culture. The Ode to the West Wing can be understood as we locate the dialectical subject matter uniting Shelley's revolutionary outlook with his deep-felt personal agony respecting the fear of death of his inner creative self. The fear of living biologically as the husk, the conscious coffin of a dead spiritual self. His defense of poetry permits one no doubt on this. In periods of great social upsurge, he argues correctly, there's a qualitative transformation of broader populations, to the effect that they suddenly acquire power to impart and receive the most profound communications respecting man and nature. Suddenly, then, the creative artist finds an audience capable and zealous in receiving and comprehending the kinds of conceptions which more directly reflect the creative processes within him. The enlivening of the minds of his audience in this way gives the inner self of the artist a social reality, as the kinds of conceptions expressing his creative processes are suddenly susceptible of life within an ennobled audience. This audience has the expression of society, gives reflected social existence to the inner self of the creative artist. In such periods, these inner creative powers, so given social identity, are awakened to the boldest exercise of their potentialities. The artist is astonished to find in himself the nearly constant outflow of such profound understanding as he had not imagined possible during earlier periods. He, his inner creative self, has become alive and has an active social existence. Then, with the ebb of social ferment, his audience lose their powers of comprehension, lose their souls, and become again the old familiar schlemiels, capable of receiving and enjoying only Philistine banalities. These audiences are mystified as to what even they themselves had admired and understood, and the creative works they embraced so enthusiastically during the preceding period of ferment. That sort of relationship between the creative artist and society, through the mediation of his audience, is the constant ironic theme of all great works of art. The life-death struggle of the artist's inner self, his creative faculties. It is the content, the deeply personal, sensuous content, he locates in every other subject and sensuous experience upon which he draws. The greatness of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind is that it expresses in a more concentrated and exact way that same topic, which is merely circumscribed through prose in his essays on love and a defense of poetry. Okay. So you can, there's many thoughts that come to mind, right, when you read something like that. Do people have a sense of what he's getting at? Just to give me a sense of how clear you guys think what he's saying is? You guys remember these mass protests, let's say the student protests, the red squares? People were really charged up, right? Montreal was pretty fired up. Or even when you go to a protest, when it has the right mood and it's not just pure rage ball, anarchistic, we don't want to pay for education. We're not thinking about the fact that the whole system's coming down. They kind of have to, when you're in a protest like that, it's necessary to care about the rest of the world when you're thinking of how you're going to change things here. But he's saying so people become open to more profound conceptions that they're usually not, right? But it's the role of the artist, it's the role of the creative individual to actually evoke that in people, right? Because otherwise they don't have it. They don't have it in school, they don't have it at home, they don't have it with their friends, they don't have it anywhere.
It sort of reminds me, I recently heard, I forget where though, but that it's, I guess it was Rush reading a webcast, who was saying that it's not policies that determine reality, but it's the reality that determines policies.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of, I'm getting a flavor of that in what you're reading here, in that you have reality that creates conditions whereby the population, when faced with a crisis that comes upon them, will be spurred on to start thinking about, well, how do I survive? How do I react to this crisis? And if you have creative people who have developed themselves available to that population, then they will be more susceptible to receive creative concepts that are outside of the conditions of the structures that brought to the crisis.
Yeah.
But then, if the crisis, if that works, and the crisis then subsides, the population goes back into a dormancy. You can't really understand what the hell motivated them and inspired them to do like an American Revolution or something.
Well, that's why you need to create your audience in a sense, because if you don't have your audience, you need to create it. If somebody's going to actually, if you're going to impart these ideas and somebody's going to receive them, but they can't because just emotionally, creatively, they're not there, well, you need to develop them. So you have to have a really good understanding of what classical art, of what truth, and of what beauty is, such that you can actually inspire them to awake themselves. So you know right then that when you see somebody's kind of shutting down and you're reporting facts about what's going on in the world, that should tell you should shift gears and you actually need to inspire them. So the real question is, how do you inspire somebody? Because what I think is interesting is this idea is he's talking about the greatest joy as well is combined with this feeling of agony, right? That there's this duality, there's this dual nature to true pleasure, true joy, which a human being can experience. So here, I'll read, just to say one more thing. Well, over here is the sculpture of Prometheus. Again, see how many people are familiar with this drama of Prometheus, which is from ancient Greece. Just to see a show of hands, so I know who I'm talking to. Prometheus. Yeah. So he made a decision to suffer, right? To suffer eternally, right? For millions of years for the sake of mankind. But he chose that. He wanted that, right? He was ready to suffer for something else, for something more important. So you have to think, for these people who we're meeting, do they actually have something more important in their life? Or do you have to be there to actually present that to them? And so this is the joy, though, that he's describing, in terms of where he said it exactly, that the poet, once you discover this joy, that you are creative, that you can make a discovery, you're overcome with joy. That you can actually do that and impart that to others. But the thing is that once someone realizes they're creative, there's a new fear, because now they realize that they're mortal. So that this inherently beautiful thing they're going to lose. So life is very bittersweet in that sense. This is what all the poets talk about, right? That there's human mortality is a lamentable thing. It's something to be sad about is normal. But the question is, what do you have to do as an individual to overcome that? How do you overcome that yourself?
But I don't think it's just his body that he's afraid is going to die. It's not his own personal mortality, is it?
Well, that's the thing. But what does that represent? What does his actual identity represent? When you pass away, what is there? What's left?
Well, I want to just add and emphasize what I think you're bringing out. In addition to the fear of losing that creative thing when he dies, I think he's developing the idea that creative self is a relatively hard to locate small part inside that we have to bring out.
Yeah.
Right? And the fear that he's describing is the fear of losing it. Like waking up one day and you're still biologically alive, but you've lost your creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think more that's what he's getting at right there. That you'll lose you'll
Yeah,
lose spiritual death while you're alive, and that creative power will be gone.
But the interesting thing is that when he develops this idea that during these times of struggle, where the general population does wake up and is able to actually hear the ideas coming through his work, that he's astonished by the fact that it's almost a constant flow of insight and capacity for expression, which then it becomes endangered when that paradox where it's actually had success in overcoming the crisis. And the paradox is that when society goes back to being able to survive, you're back into the fear of losing it, because people will go back to sleep.
Right. Yeah, there's many aspects of it, because this is the greatest power, the idea that everybody has creativity and they can use it to actually make other people discover, right, what it is we're actually talking about. So, because Shelley talks about this, I go right to the first quote. Shelley says, "Sorrow, terror, anguish, despair itself are often the chosen expressions of an approximation to the highest good. Our sympathy in tragic fiction depends on this principle. Tragedy delights by affording a shadow of the pleasure which exists in pain. This is the source also of the melancholy which is inseparable from the sweetest melody. The pleasure that is in sorrow is sweeter than the pleasure of pleasure itself." This is very paradoxical for most people, right? We're going to get back to that, but let's read this poem. This one's not too... Go ahead. It's not too...
Like the God of the dear...
Just be sure to read slow and...
Yeah, like the God of the dear friend that each time long past, the tone which is now forever fled, the hope which is now forever past, a love so sweet it could not last, was time long past. There were sweet dreams in the night, but time long past, and was the sadness of the restored light, each day, a shadow onward cast, which made us weep, it yet might last, that time long past. there is regret, almost remorse, for time long past. Tis like a silent loved course, the father watches, till at last beauty is like remembrance cast from time long past.
It's very paradoxical. Because right away, it seems like a lot of these things are things to be sad about. A friend that is no longer around, a loved one that's no longer around, a hope which is now forever past, a love so sweet it could not last. And was it sadness or delight, each day a shadow onward cast, which made us wish it yet might last, that time long past? There's regret, almost remorse for time long past. 'Tis like a child's beloved course a father watches, till at last beauty is like a remembrance, cast from time long past. That's why there's this irony that he's looking at this irony. There's an irony to human life that all these things which seem good are going to disappear. You're going to lose them one day, which is when it comes at the end of your life, biologically, when it comes to the end of somebody else's life that you care about, or all these other things, hopes, dreams, relationships. But then is there a turn? Because is this just like a sad state for a human being? Is there any human being that actually that doesn't experience this kind of situation or emotion in life? Is there somebody who's exempt from these kind of, maybe not all, but going to have to go through some of this as the fact that you're human, right? But then tis like a child's beloved course a father watches. There's a joy of having a child, raising them to become something great, but that implies that you're going to have to let them go. Because the child's going to grow up. The child is not going to remain a child, right? You see parents, right, they don't want to let their children go. They just want to hang on to them. And it's not good. It does more damage than good by far. And there's all sorts of examples. Till at last beauty is like a remembrance, cast from time long past.
Yeah, that's the term, right? Till at last.
So beauty, which seems to be a good thing, it's like the source of all these bad things is also the source for the greatest thing, for beauty, right? For the greatest joy. They seem to spill out of the same thing. So that's why there's a paradox in mortality that people have to face, that everybody is not going to be here, we're not getting younger. But it's exactly that pain, that agony, which is how are you going to overcome that? What is it you're going to then do which allows you to rise above mortality, to become immortal, to do immortal things? Right? Such that your life continues to have an effect once you're dead, right? Once you're gone. Now, let's just compare this for a second. Let's go back to this Wordsworth poem. I'll just read it. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For often on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood. They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. Now, what does he say about his poetry, Wordsworth? This is in a preface to a book of his poetry. He says, the reader will find that personifications of abstract ideas rarely occur in these volumes. I have wished to keep my reader in the company of flesh and blood. Whatever portion of this faculty we may... It's just somebody's probably in there. Whatever portion of this faculty we may suppose even the greatest poet to possess, the language which it will suggest to him must, in liveliness and truth, fall far short of that which is uttered by men in real life, under the actual pressure of those passions. The poet will feel that there is no necessity to trick out or to elevate nature. The principal object, then, which I posed to myself in these poems, was to choose incidents and situations from common life. Low and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the passions of the heart find a better soil, because in that condition of life our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity, and because from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse, they convey their feelings and notions in a simple and unelaborated expressions. So if you think about his poem about daffodils and what he's saying the common peasant has a much more, what a great life. You know, it's just simple, you know, you're just living, you know. If you think about the way people today, they're like, oh, mankind is, you know, we've done so many bad things. We've built these cities and like everybody's just stressed out. It'd be nice if we were just like back around trees and, you know, in a forest or something, right? That would be so much more happy there. It's just a simple, right? So it's a very primitive peasant idea, and he's saying this is more noble, right? The peasant is more noble than, you know, the idea of actually struggling to develop humanity or something. Actually building a city which allows you to, you know, accommodate many more people who are all potentially creative geniuses, to actually create a world where you can have these people, bring them into the world, and increase the creative power mankind has. So he's not really concerned with any of that. Right? And you see it in his poetry.
Please, when you meet people like those, and there are a lot of young people who think
Yeah.
that, like they say in Quebec, profiter de la vie.
Yeah.
When John Keats said that hopes or dreams or relationship will die. When he said that mortality. Now, how can you inspire such a person to think to be mortality?
Right, well we have to get them to overcome their mortality and think about that, right? And well, think about how, first off, Shelley's thinking about it. And we're going to go for another example, but I think it's important people actually struggle with this. Beauty is like a remembrance. Because if you know all these things are going to pass, if you know everything in a sense, in your biological life, everything that is part of your life, these things are going to fade, right? Shakespeare in the beginning, he was warning. Who said it was you that said it was a warning? Right. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender air might bear his memory. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tottered weed of small worth held. So Shakespeare is warning that all these things are going to fade. So you should think about what does last, what is durable, what is going to continue. And the first approximation is, well, when you give birth, when you have a child, when you have a family, you're contributing to the future. That will continue. to be an active force in the world.
The two are meant to be sort of taken together, right?
The sonnets?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's 155. So yeah, everybody should be working through them. In fact, you're going to have a lot more trouble organizing people if you haven't worked through something like that, because most of people who came after Shakespeare, great minds, know Shakespeare. They've studied Shakespeare. That's in a great part why they're great people, because they mastered the subject matter. So
what do you say to people who
well,
want
hang
to
on,
church?
we gotta let them suffer a bit. I think you have to suffer a bit too first before we actually get to the.
So most of the people, they go to church to overcome this feeling of mortality. So what can I tell them not that the church fulfill that or not?
After class, Dave's going to hand out a piece of paper, and you just say that to them, and they'll be calm.
Well, that's why they have to. How can they really be immortal? Because it has to be true, right? It's easy to, we meet Jehovah's Witnesses all the time, and they're really happy because they've overcome that too. But is it true? So, actually, I want to use this question of Christ, the image of Christ, the idea of Jesus Christ. It's funny that we're in a society which is very anti-Christ, right? It's a very anti-Christ society today. If you think of the way, as soon as people hear something that may even smell like religion, when you're just trying to make a point, be it about history, about whatever, as soon as they smell that, they're like, there's something wrong with you. You're talking about religion, or God forbid you mention Jesus in any way, people freak out, right? But it is because there's a lot of religious cults. But that serves the empire, right? Because people don't understand what this concept of Jesus Christ is about. And it's one of the most important concepts for all of Western civilization. It's the foundation for Western civilization in a real sense. So if Christ becomes some
Brand.
some dogmatic sort of radical brand that is just outdated, and what comes in. So Rembrandt, there's a paper here, I have several of them that I read, and it was an art review which I had actually gone to in Detroit. It was the exposition Rembrandt in the Face of Jesus in Detroit. And when I was there, I couldn't really appreciate it as much as I do now, because I didn't really get it. I didn't really get the concept of Christ in the full, in all its depth. And it's something to struggle with your whole life to actually, if you really want to understand the depth of an idea like that. And because there's many images of Christ, right? There's all sorts. Was he black? Was he white? Was he Arab? Was
African.
Chinese, African. Who was Christ? What was he? And there's all sorts of images of him, right? Portrayed as this glorious figure, this great, untouchable, eternally mortal God. And so the question that Rembrandt's struggling with, this idea of who is Christ really, in works throughout his life, spanning at least 2 decades. Which is the more glorious Christ? Which is the successful idea of Christ? Which is the most powerful one, right? So you have, what does the first one make you guys think of? Okay, but just what feeling you get when you see this? Godly.
Royal.
I'm off balance looking at it.
You're off balance?
I find it edgy.
Edgy. Interesting.
And angels there, it's pretty. Yeah.
It looks pretty glorious, like.
Looks a bit like Zeus a bit, no?
Interesting. Looks like Zeus, which is like the Antichrist,
Yes,
right? Which is
exactly like an emperor, almost.
Yeah.
That's the way I see it.
Like an emperor, like a holy emperor.
Yeah, Caesar. That's the way I see it.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Well, left picture is a bit more egocentric, like based on Jesus and showing how we celebrate Jesus for himself.
Right.
And on the right picture, it's not egocentric. You see Jesus loving the sheep, and it's not
Nice guy. You know.
right. It's not
He's gentle.
just portraying Jesus as being a God, but Jesus being loving and kind. And
Yeah, he's not the guy that's gonna, whip you to get you out of the temple or something. He's not gonna beat you up or anything.
No,
He's,
the only time Jesus ever became violent
Yes, it's
was
temple.
when he, not just a temple, he threw the money changers out of there. That's like beating up a banker, the equivalent of that.
Yeah, kind of like
That's
this.
it. And that's the reason why he was crucified.
Now let's see another set. These are actually by Rembrandt.
Wow.
Okay. Because who was Jesus? Which one is the right Jesus? There's so many different ideas of Jesus. You have to think about it. It's really not obvious, and that's what at first I didn't get. It was like, yeah, he's a holy guy. He's a glorious figure. In the first one, this one was done 20 years earlier.
This one meaning the left-hand side?
On my left, on the left-hand side. Actually, my
The
right.
one you're pointing on?
That.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. That's an earlier, that's like, I don't have the specific date, but I know this one is this is around 1648. So let's say that's like 1623. I've seen it. And so what do you see here? What comes off? What's the guy's expression? Jesus' expression you can't really see. It's hard to tell it's even Jesus. Surprised. He's surprised. He's surprised to see Jesus at his table. Scared. Yeah. And the other guy actually, this is a guy, what I understand, who's fallen off his chair.
They're so shocked that, oh my God.
Jesus is at the table.
And is
I didn't even recognize him.
is he even kneeling or something?
Well, I think he's fallen off and he's like, more about that.
Maybe just tying his shoes, I don't know.
Oh.
Actually, no, they didn't have
There's
shoes.
no time to touch.
Yeah, can you give the context of that thing? Like, this is a specific scene.
Yeah.
It's after the resurrection.
Well, that's the thing. The key thing is that the guy is surprised though. He didn't know to see Jesus here, but yes, this is after the resurrection of Christ, right? Because it had been reported that the tomb was empty, right? And they had run into some guy who had been, and they said some things that seemed to lack faith in the prophecies of Isaiah and all that. And this figure this stranger that they met, during the supper at Emmaus. That's how you say it. And they invited this guy to supper, not knowing who it was. And then finally, he breaks the bread, and he realizes this is Christ, resurrected. On the other side is 1648, around, by Rembrandt again. And look at this one. Great.
Looks like Shelley.
Pardon me?
It looks kind of like Shelley.
Well, it looks like a normal human being.
It looks like he has 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. It looks like he's just seen some really terrible stuff.
Yeah, there's suffering. Yeah, that's a good observation. It seems like it's somebody who's suffered, who's undergone suffering, who's deep in his thoughts as well. And how could you say that? It's hard to describe in words. It's a very profound emotion, but it's yet very human. Right? It's very. Pardon me? Vulnerable. That's actually that's pretty much the word I was looking for. A very vulnerable human being, suffering.
Yeah, it's funny because Rembrandt always portrayed Christ as a human being with the idea that every human being has the ability to be Christ, and also that Christ was a human being.
Mm-hmm.
It's both ways. That you have to. Like Rembrandt, he always would show himself in all these historic paintings as like an audience, one of the audience to some biblical story.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah.
Because had recently gone to a presentation of the St. John's Passion concert, Bach's St. John's Passion, and she said it was really great. You know, there were some very profound ideas that were discussed based on how Bach approached this question of St. John's Passion from the Gospel. And so, because to think about which is actually the most powerful, the most glorious of Christ's, well, he begins the chorus in St. John's Passion with, Lord our Master, whose glory fills the whole earth, show us by your passion that you, the true eternal Son of God, triumph even the deepest humiliation. Even in the deepest suffering, the deepest humiliation, you triumph. That he's actually succeeding because he did suffer. Right? Success is in the fact that he was suffering. Not that he was untouchable, but that he overcame his suffering. And so you have this one by, just to go to the actual picture. Full screen. So this is by Rembrandt. It's Jesus calming the sea when they're voyaging in the Sea of Galilee, I believe. So we see you have Jesus here, and he's with his apostles. It's interesting to count how many there are, right? Because how many apostles was Jesus supposed to have? 12.
There's actually, there's 12 apostles plus Jesus.
Oh, okay. Let's count them.
Okay. Does anybody get anything else? We don't just want to. How many people are there in the?
In grand total, there's 13 people.
Okay,
But
you see 13.
I see more.
Not counting Jesus or counting Jesus?
Actually, it's 13 with Jesus, 12 without. I'm actually thinking.
Okay, because can everybody maybe to make sure it's bright enough.
There's
We're
also.
just gonna count them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There's just also. I have a feeling is that cargo beneath like the sail, or is that just somebody hiding there?
Let's count.
Yeah, let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Then 6,
7, 8, 9. This is a person here crouching. 10, 11, 12, 13.
Hold on. A person crouching. What?
That person is crouching like this here. He's crouching like praying.
So it's 13.
Yeah.
13, 14 with Christ.
14. I still. Never mind.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,
11, 12.
11, 12. And then there's this guy, 13, and there's this guy, 14.
And that.
Okay, so there's 14.
Totally didn't see that person.
Yeah, it's a bit hard. You guys can come closer if you don't believe me. But
Yeah,
there's
I see
14.
it. I see it.
Okay. It's interesting. There's 14 we can see. It's very interactive.
The class is a little bit.
Can we have somebody?
Can you make it?
Somebody confirm what I'm saying to make
Yes.
sure we're.
Absolutely.
Can we just hear the number, please?
Oh wait, yeah. Those are like this is his hands and it's like bowing out this way. There's
14.
Okay.
Actually, it's
14,
there, yeah.
including Christ.
Including
You can even make it bigger.
Okay.
Where is
okay.
Judas?
Um, so now just back to the thing.
It must be the sailor man, the other one.
Yeah.
The owner of the ship.
Looks like
Yeah,
him.
that's it, exactly.
Okay. Do people know who that is in the corner?
Right there.
Rembrandt.
That's Rembrandt? Okay.
Not?
Okay. Because we said there's how many in the 14?
14.
Okay. So you have 12 apostles, you have Christ, which makes 13. Who could the 14th person be? Do people maybe point out which one he is?
Make it bigger.
I think I know which
We're gonna zoom in, and somebody's gonna have to point and come.
What is he doing?
My stupid. It's just blocking here, all the way.
The one, his mother.
There. It goes
You
back.
should've
I
moved
don't
it.
have them like that.
Yeah,
I'm
why
not
don't
that
you
one.
move
good.
it?
You should have moved it.
Okay.
Maybe,
It's
yeah.
bloody thing. I think this is easier.
Yeah.
Yeah, zoom
Another
in
one,
once more.
another time.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Alright. So you guys better remember what Rembrandt looks like, because now we're zoomed in, so we don't have his picture. So you have these folks. The last one. Can somebody, if somebody see them, can you just come to the board and point it out? Or
Is it the guy holding the...
To the board, to the board.
well, could somebody go to the board and point it out so that we're not?
Oh, there's actually an extra person in there. Is there a 15th in there? In the actual, cabinet?
There's debate over that, but that's not because we're looking for Rembrandt. Because Rembrandt.
Where's your, where you point?
I have a big debate with
Yeah,
that.
where's Charlie?
If somebody thinks they see, should I go back to Rembrandt's face?
Please.
Please.
If somebody thinks
do.
they see him,
I think it's the guy with the hand on his face holding the rope.
can you just come to the board and point it out? So
The only guy holding a rope.
Yeah, the guy in the front with the light blue.
This guy.
Ta-da.
Okay.
I think it's the guy behind him.
You think it's the guy behind him?
Ah, spottas.
The guy, this guy.
Yeah.
Why? Can't see his face. How do you know it's him?
Yeah.
That's hard. That's so hard.
Okay. And
What about the guy that
so
looks like?
it's a baseless hypothesis, but if you'd like to stick to it, we can. I don't.
We won't laugh.
So let's just go back, just to get an image of his face again.
Yeah, there's better self-portraits that Rembrandt did that look
Okay, well, somebody who is more familiar with what Rembrandt looks like. It's actually, yeah,
He's young.
It's this
On
guy.
on this.
but what's interesting about this guy compared to all the other ones?
He's the only one
looking at Jesus. He's looking in a different way.
He's the only
He's
one
looking
looking
at
this
you.
way. Right.
Yeah, he's looking
He's
towards
looking
the
at
audience.
you.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the only one looking this way.
He's looking at us. Are you in Jesus' ship? Are you an apostle? Are you an apostle for truth? Right? That's who he's looking at. And he's looking to see who's there. So that's a surprise, right? Because he's saying anybody can be Christ-like. This idea that human beings are talking pigs, that everybody's greedy and all that, that's all bullshit. That's all from making people think with the kind of oligarchical system that we have, the way it's organized, that everybody is just a pig that has its own self-interest and whatnot. And that's the kind of world that you have to adapt to. But that's not true. In fact, Jesus Christ, Socrates, these people, the point is everybody can be like that. Everybody actually has the capacity. Everybody can suffer. Everybody can have charity, right? Everybody can be creative. And that's the actual man in the image of God, man in the image of a creator, of a creative principle. That's it. It's actually, it's not an outside, it's not a brilliant light around you or some, immortal shield. It's that you're mortal, but it's that you human beings have this unique creative quality. They have a quality for charity, for agape, the caring for others, and actually, because of that, to overcome their own suffering, right? To go through the suffering to face the fact they're mortal, but to rise above that. Say, what can they actually do? Being mortal, which will actually allow them to overcome their mortal coil, to become immortal. So there's this intrinsic suffering involved in being human. But that's not the problem. The question is, how do you overcome it? So this is a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, which I recently discovered in this article, which I base a good deal of my presentation on from our Fidelio magazine by Paul Gallagher. I have a few copies. Everybody should read this, because it's amazing. But, so this is Paul Laurence Dunbar, The Lesson, 1896. Right, and this is a freed slave, right, from what I understand. So this is somebody who's gone through a lot. Who would like to read this? Avni, why don't you read this?
My cot was down by a cypress grove, and I sat by my window the whole night long, and heard well up from the deep dark wood a mockingbird's passionate song. And I thought of myself so sad and lone, in my life's cold winter that knew no spring, of my mind so weary and sick and wild, of my heart too sad to sing. But e'en as I listened to the mockbird's song, a thought stole into my saddened heart, and I said, I can cheer some other soul by a carol's simple art. For oft from the darkness of hearts and lives come songs that brim with joy and light, and out of the gloom of the cypress grove the mockingbird sings at night. So I sang a lay for a brother's ear, in a strain to soothe his bleeding heart, and he smiled at the sound of my voice and lyre, though mine was a feeble art. But at his smile I smiled in turn, and into my soul there came a ray. In trying to soothe another's woes, mine own had passed away.
It's called The Lesson.
I didn't really get that last line.
The last line.
Yeah.
But at his smile I smiled in turn, and into my soul there came a ray. In trying to soothe another's woes, another's pains, another's, mine own had passed away. How did he actually resolve his own suffering? How did he overcome his own suffering?
Helping others.
Well, it was by going past his own life, right? Going beyond just his life and actually seeing how can you have an effect on others, right? Which is you're not just living for yourself, you're living for others. And when you do that, you're actually able to overcome your mortal existence, because the fact is that you're living your life for everybody. You're not living it for yourself. But in our society of pleasure and pain, where that's the governing principle that everybody has to submit to, people don't want to suffer, right? They want to be happy. They want pleasure. They want joy. They don't want to go through the pain of actually having to face themselves, to overcome themselves, and overcome the fears they have. Right? They don't want to think about the fact that they're mortal, right? And because they never want to go there, they never actually want to face the pain that's involved in accepting your mortality and going through that excruciating process, in a sense. And I'm using these words with a very specific sense, right? Where you become creative and you overcome your mortality by this creative power that you then use to create an idea, to actually generate a concept, a beautiful composition, or a discovery, which actually changes life for everybody else, which actually has an effect in shaping history, that's the power that every human being has. So that's the real power. It's this creative power that people have. And it's when they don't have that, right, they're not free. They're trapped because of their fear of suffering. They're trapped because of their fear of pain. That's actually what's holding them back, right? They should actually enjoy suffering, because that's how they're actually going to become creative. So let's read the Keats one. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and character hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. When I behold upon the night-starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and feel that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. What is this? And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more. What fair creature is he talking about? What is? It's not something that lasts long. If you think about this creative capacity that once you discover you have it, there is this great joy, but at the same time there's exactly that pain of realizing you're going to lose it. So you're going to have to do something to actually make something with your life such that this thing actually has a life of its own, right? Your ideas can actually continue to do something, to inspire others. So this is in a negative sense. This question of creativity, this question of mortality, in a negative sense, he's saying, of the wide world I stand alone and think. Love and fame to nothingness do sink. All these petty fears that people have. You know, people want to be loved, they want to be accepted, they want to be known, they want to be famous. These things don't mean anything because of his identity, because of how he actually thinks of himself as a poet. These things mean nothing. So he's free because he knows he has this creative power, but the fear of losing it is also the greatest pain. And so Shakespeare, guides us in all these things that Wordsworth holds so dear. These daffodils, these whatever you and your friends, everybody, whatever they think is dear, that's very ephemeral, that's just going to pass, which we all like so much in the moment. Well, Shakespeare warns us, right? This is Sonnet 65. Since grass, nor stone, nor earth, nor boundless sea, but sad mortality o'ersways their power, how with this rage shall beauty hold a plea, whose action is no stronger than a flower? Oh, how shall summer's honey breath hold out against the wrackful siege of battering days, when rocks impregnable are not so stout, nor gates of steel so strong, but time decays. O fearful meditation, where, alack, shall time's best jewel from time's chest lie hid? Or what strong hand can hold his swift foot back? Or who his spoil of beauty can forbid? O none, unless this miracle have might, that in black ink my love may still shine bright. And so that's the real power of the individual. That's where the true power of actually changing things comes from. It's from this realization and the steps you take, therefore, knowing that this is your mortal life and what you're going to do with it. So that's where I'd end it. I think that's really the lesson that people have to take on. So you have to be ready to go through a bit of pain if you actually want to reach true joy, which is the joy of being creative and actually changing others. Because the irony is, you can know all these things, you can even be a good artist, or you can know stuff, you can be a smart scientist, but to save yourself, you have to save others. Because otherwise this power you have is nothing. Right? depends on this question of agape, of charity. So that's it. C'est ma classe. Daffodils, and
I haven't walked.
you're really like, wow, this is amazing, right?
I haven't walked in a
So-
field of flowers in a long time.
Yeah, maybe everybody should do that. They'd be more relaxed, right? Just to keep going.
The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a conjunct company.
Shocking company.
Company, sorry. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my coach I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils.
It's almost like he was taking the daffodils for granted, and then he's realized how
awesome they are.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to something else. Let's just think about that, because I think that's, for this one, you know, I think there's more to be said. I don't think we've really scratched the surface of what, how Keats is actually thinking about all this. Sure, it's one thing to be pressed for time, but people are pressed for times for all sorts of things, right? Some people may be around here to actually get to the meeting on time, while some people are pressed to, you know, do their makeup, their everything, their hair.
Catch a television show.
Catch a television show. People get really vicious sometimes if they're gonna miss their show.
I know.
So we're gonna use two more examples, because we really have to draw this out, work it through, and really get a sense of what's wrong with the way people think about themselves today. Right? What are actually their priorities? Why is that their priorities? What are the right priorities? You know, what's the right thing to do? Is there a right thing to do with your life as opposed to a wrong thing? Or is it really do what makes you happy? You know, stare at daffodils your whole life, because that's what makes you happy. So here, why don't I read this one? From fairest creatures we desire increase, that there by beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decease, his tender hire might bear his memory. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies. Thyself, thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel. Thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, and only herald to the gaudy spring, within thine own bud buryest thy content, and, tender churl, makest waste the niggarding. Pity the world, or else this glutton be, to eat the world's due by the grave in thee. This is the first sonnet in Shakespeare's series, his sonnet series, that goes on for 155, where he develops really
If I can
a
just,
scene.
if I can just say.
I want to hear somebody else first, just
I'm so sorry.
just so you don't, taint what
I
other
didn't
people.
want to just not call.
What do people think? Has anybody ever read this before? I asked for Keats. How many people have read Shakespeare's poetry or sonnets before today? Can I see a show of hands? How many people have read them before today?
The whole thing?
Okay, no, just the sonnets in general.
Okay.
So we're gonna go slow because we.
What does he mean by making a famine where abundance lies?
Well, interesting. Let's say this is it's not the same thing, but on a simple level, in making a famine, let's say Africa, there's plenty of food, but yet it's not going to anybody. So you have something, but its use is being spoiled, right? You have a famine where abundance lies. Abundance, there's plenty, yet it's not going to use, right? There's a waste. There's a wasteful quality to it.
This is the crux of the strategy of the British Empire. This is what we're seeing throughout Europe, throughout here in Canada. This is the whole center piece of the fracking of Canadian, where even here our own government is telling us we're, well, you know, in the EU it's austerity and
Yeah.
so on. And
Could you refine that in terms of, what do you mean specifically this? Could you draw
well,
out
in that
what makes you
specific
think
phrase,
that?
making a famine where abundance lies.
Okay, but keep
I
in
see.
mind what's he talking, what's Shakespeare actually talking. The only other thing, sorry, do people, when he says increase, from fairest creatures we desire increase, that means increase has to do with the belly getting big birth, carrying labor, carrying a child, having a child. So from fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die, but as the riper should by time decease, his tender hire might bear his memory.
No, air.
Air.
His tender air might bear his memory. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies. Thyself thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel. So, just that first part, do people have any hypotheses as to what?
Well, I think he's talking about some sort of potential going wasted.
Okay, what potential?
Well, so I don't quite get what, as the riper should by time decease, but based on what.
Okay, well if are you getting younger? Do you know anybody who's getting? When I behold upon the night starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and feel that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. What are people's first thoughts on this? When you first think about this, and we can read it a second time, in fact, Rouge says that to understand a good classically composed poem, you have to read it 2-3 times. But on first glance, what kind of mood do you think he's in?
Pressed for time.
Pressed for time.
Got to hustle. Got to get stuff done. You may not.
Okay.
Stuff like that.
Okay. How's he doing for time then?
He lived to be 24.
Right.
So he's basically just says that, you know, that he's just worried that he won't be able to completely fulfill his dreams, which is what he's saying. He just doesn't have the time for it. Not busyness or anything else. Just
Okay. And can I just see how many people have actually read any of John Keats's poetry before today? Can we have a show of hands?
I heard about it many years ago, but I never read it.
Does a tiny amount count?
Pardon me?
A tiny amount?
A tiny amount, yeah, sure. Okay. So you've had a taste. Okay, well, let's try another one. And because we're going to get back to this, but I want you to think about, it's interesting what Salim said, pressed for time. If you think about the way people are reacting today when we're talking about the danger of World War III, economic collapse, that we actually have to launch these things like the new Silk Road, fusion power, they don't seem very pressed for time on these issues. But yet when you actually invite them to an event, they're interested, they seem to never have time, to actually become political, to actually do something, be an active force in this. So this one is by Wordsworth, who is another poet around Keats's time, a bit before, and during as well.
Dave, can you try and adjust the focus? On
Yeah.
the top of the picture?
Is that better? So let's get a sense of what this one's about. Can somebody read this for me? Salim, go ahead.
I wandered lonely as a cloud, by William the Wordsworth, that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine, and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretch in never-ending line along margins of a bay. 10,000 I saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, when then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. That is beautiful.
Okay. What do you think it's about? And I just have to, this is just one small, the title is also the first line. I think it was just pasted.
Yeah, I wandered lonely as a cloud.
Yeah, and then you go to the next line. But what do you, and not just Salim, because it's not going to work, but what do you think? What's the start? You said it's beautiful, that's a big statement.
It is beautiful, it is beautiful. It's because the way how it makes it is how an observer, it seems like that he's not really taking part in this because he's flying as a cloud. This could be another way of saying that he's basically being a spectator of life elsewhere, and that he just simply, that even this fills him with such great pleasure, but at the same time he's just not there with them. He's not with the people who are dancing and the line or everything else. He's observing them from a distance, but at the same time this brings him such great joy at the
Okay.
basically
Well, what kind of emotions would we say is going on here? And I'm gonna pick on somebody. Sorry, I have a bad habit of doing this. Matthew, what do you think is don't mind me.
Yeah.
Pick something. What kind of emotions would you say? We can read it again if we might want to read it again. Here, why don't you read it again?
Yeah, okay. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. When all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle in the Milky Way, they stretch in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. Then thousands saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance.
Okay, let's just stop there for a second. So up until now, I'm getting, he's talking about daffodils, right? Golden daffodils. He sounds pretty, entertained by them, right? Or amazed by the daffodils, amazement. C'est des pissenlits. Il est pas mal impressionné par des pissenlits, right? You guys ever walk through a field of daffodils? Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. So just to continue on the train of thought that Avni finished with, yeah, the problem is not, people can easily say people are not informed, they're not educated. Yes, but what happens when you try and educate them, right? It's not like everybody is just, starving to be educated and to know things. Oftentimes it's more the younger people who know they don't really know much and they want to understand, so there's a lot better opportunity to actually recruit these people, and that's what we have to do. You actually have to recruit young people and explain to them that right now it's not your fault, but humanity doesn't have a future if we don't actually win this fight. And the problem is that even if you explain things to people and they do understand it, it's an emotional block. And that's what I want to kind of address. What's wrong with the way people think about themselves today? Especially, the classic is always, this happens so often, somebody sees our signs, our setup, and they say, oh yeah, I know all about that, and they just keep walking. Like, they don't even stop, and we're saying stop World War III, past Glass-Steagall, and they know all about that, and they didn't stop, which is pretty paradoxical, very paradoxical. And that's because emotionally these people are very weak. They're not actually able to respond to reality. They're like voyeurs, right? They're watching reality. They're waiting for something to happen. So they don't actually see themselves as in this process. They're waiting for something to happen. And so today, that's the point, I want to address this cultural problem using the subject matter of a few poems and some other artistic examples, some classical artistic examples, not just any art, because that could also really disorganize you if I was just to use anything, as we'll see. So with that said, right away, let's just jump into the first poem, which is going to set the pace for how we want to think about things. We're going to have to discover what this is really about. I'll just read the first one. I'm going to ask people to help out to read things as well. So this is by John Keats, who was a poet who died at the age of 24. And he managed to actually excel and become one of the greatest English poets that human history has ever seen at 24. And he was actually sick for a large part of his life, so he wasn't always in a condition to actually write beautiful things. So he says, and it's just titled, there's no title, it's the first line. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain,